Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Diplomatic Immunity from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. Welcome to the first episode of our sixth season of Diplomatic Immunity. For this season's theme, we'll be covering the litany of unintended consequences and strategic surprises emanating from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. From energy to technology to intelligence to geopolitical alignment, Russia's invasion marks a sea change in numerous areas of diplomacy and foreign policy. We'll be getting together with the best professionals in these fields to take stock and analyze where these trends may be headed. We're starting off strong for our first episode, speaking to former Deputy and Acting CIA Director Michael Morell on the impact and use of intelligence as a tool of diplomacy and foreign policy.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Vladimir Putin has been planning this for months, as we've been saying all along. He moved more than 175,000 troops, military equipment, and positions along the Ukrainian border. He moved blood supplies into position, which tells you all you need to know about his intentions all along.
You just heard a clip at the top of the show demonstrating how President Biden and his national security team were warning us about Putin's intentions all the way up to the day of the invasion of Ukraine, using selective intelligence releases to prove Putin's malign intentions and laying bare the falsehoods he used to justify his attack. I'll discuss the impacts of these decisions and more with this season's first guest. Michael is the chairman of the risk analysis firm Beacon Global Strategies and a professor at George Mason University. He previously served 33 years in the CIA, including as George W. Bush's daily intelligence briefer on September 11th, and he went on to be Deputy CIA Director in the Obama administration and Acting Director from 2012 to 2013. He now also hosts his own podcast, Intelligence Matters, which we encourage listeners to check out. Find a link in our show notes. Let's listen to the conversation. Joining us today, we have a fellow member, I guess my other partner in crime on the Cuyahoga Falls Intel Mafia, Michael Morell, the former acting director of the CIA and deputy director. As we were getting ready to do this podcast, we ended up realizing that we grew up in the same, I wouldn't say small town, but the same town in a suburb of Akron, Ohio, a couple decades apart, but we're both from Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. So Michael, welcome and thanks for joining the show.
Thanks, Kelly. It's great to be with you. And I'm blessed for a lot of things. And one of those was growing up in Cuyahoga Falls.
I feel the same way and get back as often as I can. My family's still there. And we will refrain from boring all of our listeners about our Cleveland sports chat. We'll leave that to another time. But in our commiseration, I guess you should say. Anyways, well, thanks for joining us. And, as I noted, one of the things we're focusing on this season on the podcast is the unintended consequences, strategic surprises coming out of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and sort of what we think is going to be changed by that and how the world's going to move forward. And obviously, at the beginning of that war, a big aspect of it was intelligence and the way that the Biden administration used intelligence. And I don't want to say it was necessarily unprecedented because there's been instances of declassifying things in the past, but I think not necessarily to the level that they declassified a lot of intelligence information to share with partners, to even put in the press, to kind of tell everybody, hey, we keep saying the Russians are going to invade Ukraine. They're probably going to do some false flag activities to make it look like a reason for them to go in, and then showing it to the world to try to convince the world. So, can you talk a little bit about how big of a deal that kind of was? Because it's not every day that you declassify a bunch of stuff and that rapidly and put it out to the public, share it with allies. So what were your thoughts when you saw that?
Yeah. So I think you made a super important point, because I've seen a lot of people say that this was unprecedented, and it wasn't. The U.S. has declassified intelligence hundreds of times, in the past 30, 40, 50 years for a variety of different reasons, right? Usually to justify a U.S. action that has just taken place, so think of Reagan's release of SIGINT after we bombed Libya in response to their bombing of the discotheque in Germany, right, that killed American soldiers, or in anticipation of an American action. So think the Powell speech, right, before the UN on Iraq WMD, right? But there have been times we have released intelligence that was designed in some way to educate the world, in some way to hopefully change behavior in the world. So think of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the president decided to put it out there, not to justify something the US was going to do, but to try to change Soviet behavior. Or think of President Obama going out and telling the world about Iran's secret underground enrichment facility in Qom, right, that we had just discovered with the French and the British and the Israelis. That was designed to change Iranian behavior. It was designed to get them to disclose to the IAEA, right, that facility. So it's not unprecedented. So I asked myself sort of what's new, and I think you got it right too. I think it was the sustainment of the release of intelligence over, a period of time, which was pretty heavy in those first couple of months, but which has really been, maintained throughout to some degree, not only by us but by our allies as well. So I think, what did I think when I saw it? I thought this is, number one, really smart. Not only because we were taking away from Putin possible predicates that he could use, right, to invade Ukraine, which I think would have helped him even more in the world and would have made it more difficult with his own public, although I'm not sure that matters that much. But the other was, right, to really call him out as a liar, because he kept on, while we were saying he's going to invade, he kept on saying, I'm not going to invade. I'm not going to invade. I don't know what these guys are talking about, right? So then when he does invade, everybody looks at them and say, the United States was right, he was lying, right? And I think that was helpful. B, I thought we must not have deep penetrations inside the Kremlin, because I think if we did, we wouldn't have done that. I think what, the intelligence we released here was probably sort of unencrypted military comms, going back and forth between units and command centers, going back and forth between people talking on phones when they shouldn't be talking on phones back to Moscow. So unencrypted comms, right, which are fragile, which you're not going to be able to maintain over time. It told me I really doubt that we have somebody, sitting next to Putin, right, who's hearing his plans, right? But if I'm the DNI or I'm the head of CIA or I'm the head of NSA, right, I'm going to be comfortable giving up, the kind of intelligence I talked about. I'm not going to be comfortable taking a risk, right, with a human asset or a SIGINT asset that's a deep penetration of Russia. So my third thought when I saw this was a little bit of worry in terms of the pressure to use this tool going forward. I think we should be using the tool more than we have historically. I think there's real value in that, but I also worry about overuse. And we can talk about why. I'm sure we'll get to why, down the road in the conversation.
Yeah, you make really good points on this. And we talked a little bit too before you came on. We were both Presidential Daily Briefing book briefers. And I remember vividly at one point when I was briefing Secretary Kerry, there was some stuff on a bad actor in the world. And he was like, let's get this declassified so that I can share it with the UN again to sort of put pressure on people. And, I think we were able to get some of that declassified to share. But again, obviously sources and methods and things like that go into it. And we'll talk more about that and why that's potentially dangerous and why we try to steer away from, giving up those things. But, one question I have too, kind of going back and maybe playing into the release of some of this stuff and sort of getting ahead of the game this time around. Do you think this was a lessons learned from 2013, 2014 and Putin, the way he did things in Ukraine and before, and the growth of Kremlin misinformation and disinformation over the ensuing years, and sort of us kind of getting ahead of the game this time around and knowing sort of his playbook on what he wants to do and thinking, okay, we can release this stuff to try to get ahead of him, like you had mentioned?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know, right? I wasn't in the room for, whose idea was this, right? Who said, hey, and, what was their reasoning when they said, hey, maybe we should think about doing this, right? That very well could have been it. I think, in my view, you're not going to be surprised by this at all. My view is that the real lesson learned from 2013, 2014 is you got to respond. You got to stand up and say no, right? That's the difference between now and then, right? And you got to support, you got to support our partners, of which Ukraine is one. And we didn't do that in 2014. We certainly did it this time around.
Yeah, and to follow up on your other point, you'd mentioned that we'd probably get to this at some point, but I think we talk about whether or not this is going to be the new normal on some levels in the future. And like you said, I think there's a lot of people that are, rightfully looking for more ways to use intel in the diplomatic world. There's a happy medium that we can try to find on where we can use this a little bit more than we did in the past. There's a lot of stuff that's probably been, overclassified, that's not going to give away sources and methods that we can try to share on a diplomatic level with folks to advance our agendas, but then you got to be careful not to go the opposite direction. What do you see as the downsides of going too far on this, and how does that get into ensuring that we don't get into accidentally giving up sort of sources and methods and things like that?
So I'm going to surprise you here a little bit, I think. So my concerns are not sources and methods, because I'm confident that the intelligence community, right, is never going to give in on that point, right? That if they're ever concerned about sources and methods, that will win the day. I can just see the conversation in the sit room, with the Secretary of State saying, "Hey, I think we should release this," and the DNI saying, "This is a highly sensitive source, and we can't take the risk." End of discussion. No, I worry about two other things. So, Kelly, as you know better than anybody, intelligence is not always right, right? Even the raw information, the raw human, the raw SIGINT, right, is not always correct. Sources get things wrong, sources lie, right, to ingratiate themselves with their case officers. Even when people are on the phone talking to each other or sending each other emails, right, they can spin things, they can lie to each other. Intelligence is not always right. And then you get to the whole analysis piece where you're trying to put those pieces together, right? And you're trying to put a 1,000-piece puzzle together, and you only have 250 of the pieces, right? And so even the analysis is fragile and uncertain and risks being wrong. So one of my concerns is that if you're going to do this, you better be confident that you're going to be right a heck of a lot more often than you're going to be wrong. And intelligence is a business where, by its very nature, you're going to get things wrong. And if you get something wrong, it's not only the intelligence community getting it wrong and misinforming policy, it's the credibility of the United States of America if you start using this stuff diplomatically. I'm concerned about that, right? The other thing I'm concerned about is policymakers, as you know better than anybody, policymakers have an agenda. The intelligence community's agenda is to say, here's what we think of the situation that we're looking at, right? Whether you want to hear it or not, here's what we see. Trying to be as objective as possible. Policymakers are not trying to be objective. Policymakers are trying to make an argument, right? They're trying to make an argument for their policy. Once there's a policy, they're trying to make an argument to our allies and partners and adversaries about, why this policy makes sense and what we're trying to do, and they're trying to sell it to the American people. And I worry that there's a risk in terms of when you declassify intelligence that you go further than what the intelligence says. There's a risk, right, of policymakers in that release going further than what the intelligence says. Netanyahu does this all the time, right? He releases intelligence. He says, look what we just stole from Iran, right? All of these documents about their nuclear weapons program, right? And he doesn't put into context that all of that stuff is 10 years old. So he's spinning. So I think that if we're going to use this tool, what is actually said has got to be left in the hands of intelligence professionals and not be allowed to be spun by policy.
Yeah, that makes sense, obviously. And I think a lot of times we do this to beat back misinformation and disinformation. And then if this stuff gets used as misinformation and disinformation for political purposes, you undermine everything. Again, I think the credibility part of it is a big thing as well. If you're going and trying to sell, say the South Africans on something and it blows up in your face, that just undermines everything else you're trying to do with South Africa vis-a-vis, let's say it's Russia and every other country or every other bilateral relationship you have with them. So I think you're spot on. It needs to be done carefully, and to maintain this as a successful tool, you need to use it sparingly, I think, when you go forward.
And probably, right, I mean, you and I spent a lot of time at senior levels in the Obama administration, right? And you know that they had a process for everything.
Mm-hmm.
They were process heavy, which I actually think is a good thing. Right? It can slow decision making, absolutely, but at the end of the day, I think you make better policy. And I think it would make sense to actually have a policy, a written policy about how you're going to release this and what the rules of the road are, right? That this administration and future administration, maybe even an executive order, right? That this administration and future administrations, have to follow or have to, formally change.
No, I think that's a fantastic idea. And I think, I know that there's been discussions, places like state as well, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, on looking into sort of how can we use intel more in diplomacy. And, I think there's, multiple levels of this too, right? There's the level of like, we're going to share this with our allies, but then also directly give it to the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN to plaster it all over the place. There's that level of it to like try to stop an invasion. But then there's a level of, we're working with a hedging country and they're hedging between us and China or us and Russia. And we've got some information that we want to share with them to kind of show them the nefarious things that China and Russia are trying to do. How do we do that? So there's multiple levels of this. And I think, coming up with a policy on that as best you can. Obviously, every context is different in every situation, but I do think having some sort of, guidelines to follow would be very useful. So moving on a little bit beyond sort of US intel or another nation state's intel, this has been growing for some time, and you had to deal with it some still when you were in government, when this was kind of becoming more ubiquitous. But another aspect that the Russia's invasion of Ukraine sort of put out in the open as far as intel goes is the fact that this isn't necessarily just a game for nation states anymore. And the fact that, I remember in the lead up in the month or two before the Russian invasion, there would be open source satellite imagery of the bare empty space that's 2 miles from the Ukraine border in November. And then the satellite shows the picture in January, and there's all these new barracks and hospitals built, and all these Russian armored vehicles and everything. There's GPS showing traffic jams, leading to Ukraine from Russia and stuff. So how do you think about that as an intel person now? How is that? Is it helpful? Is it hurtful? Is it kind of both depending on the situation? Like, how do you view sort of this more ubiquitous nature of just what we used to term or think of as intel and intelligence that only nation states could usually get? This is out there much more broadly now.
Yeah. So I think in general, it's a good thing. It's a good thing in two respects, right? One is it's an independent source of intelligence, right? And I don't think that's a bad thing, right? I think that's a good thing for the public to have another view of, a situation that, is somewhat unique, right? I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, because
Um,
some people might not want to believe the United States if we
exactly,
show them
exactly.
intel. Yeah.
Exactly, right? But it's also, right, at the same time, it's a good thing in the sense that we should be using that, right? That should become an input, just like everything else, right? That's the US government collects. We should collect that legally, right? Which means buying it probably, right? Collect that and use it, right? And I don't think we're doing that to the extent that we should, right? This is the whole open source question, right? Data and analysis, right? I put both of those in that open source category. So we should be using that. That's the second thing. That's the second good. The other thought I have, which I've been thinking a lot about in recent days, because I'm trying to keep up with what's going on in the Middle East, is in a crisis situation like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or what happened 2 weeks ago in Israel, and everything that's happened since, and where we're going, right? That one of the most important, and you'll remember this, right, from your time briefing, one of the most important roles the intelligence community can play is what is actually happening. Let's separate the signal from the noise, right? Let's separate the wheat from the chaff. You'll remember we used to produce, and I'm sure we still do, something called the executive update. And for your listeners who don't know, the executive update is basically just, here's what happened in the last 24 hours with a little bit of analysis. But the value of it, right, is to level set everybody. Is to say, you can read all these articles in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. You can talk to your friends, right? You can listen to this think tank and that think tank. There's all this stuff going around, but what is actually happening that I can pretty much take to the bank? And that's the value of the executive update. And I'm sure it still exists, if not in that name, some other name. And I'm sure it brings the same amount of value. So I think the open source analysis out there and collection that's out there kind of muddies the water even more for policymakers and makes things like the executive update even more valuable because there's more noise out there. And so is this imagery that's collected, and this is what they say, and this is what they say it means, is that really right? Right? What is actually going on here? So I think it makes actually at the end of the day the intelligence community even more valuable. The more information there is, the more valuable the analysis is.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be even more true in the coming years because we haven't even talked yet about, AI. And we've started to see obviously more and more misinformation, disinformation in the last couple of years, but like the growth of AI and what has been out there with the Israel-Hamas stuff in the last couple of weeks, I think that's just going to add a whole nother layer of policymakers, needing the intel community to sort of say, no, that's fake, this is not happening, here's what's happening. And yeah, I think yeah, the executive updates, man, I remember those well. And sometimes we had multiple on multiple issues and regions, and yeah. So
The analysts didn't like writing them because it's basically repertorial, but they were still incredibly valuable to the policymakers.
right, exactly, like you said, it's just here's what's happening. But yeah, I think that's important to note, and I think I really take to heart your mention too of the analytical community needing to use that open source stuff more. I remember my time as an analyst, there was sort of and it was just kind of a mentality in the IC and the analysis shops, whether or not it was CIA or INR where I was, or DIA or wherever, that kind of, well, we've got the secret stuff, so we know what's really going on. So there was kind of a disdain almost to sort of the open source stuff or outside analysis. Well, they don't really know what's going on because they're not reading what we're reading. And I don't agree with that. There might be some instances where we might have known something else that they didn't, but a lot of times, a lot of those people writing those analysis were actually on the ground in places and not, at CIA headquarters in Virginia or the State Department or something. So, I do think there has been a need, and there's going to be even more of a need to figure out how to bring in that open source intel to get the full picture of what's happening on the ground.
And I do think it's moving in the right direction. My view, it needs to move faster, but I think it is moving in the right direction.
Yeah. Moving us forward a little bit, and you already mentioned this, but I know we started talking Russia, Ukraine, and that's kind of what the whole season is about, like the fallen effects of that. But, I'd be remiss not to ask you about Israel and Hamas now that we have you on here. And, this idea of the intelligence failure coming out of the surprise and everything. So, having been in the positions you were in, we noted briefly before we started recording that you were President Bush's PDB briefer on the day of 9/11. Israelis are calling this their 9/11 and everything. So, kind of what were your first thoughts as a former senior intel executive when this happened?
So I had a couple of thoughts. One was obviously an intelligence failure. Two, not only an intelligence failure, but also a military operational failure. When it takes the IDF 6, 8 hours to show up somewhere in Israel that's being attacked by Hamas, that's a military failure. Three, at least initially, and maybe even still today, although it's died down a little bit in the United States, there was much more talk about Israel's intelligence failure in the United States than there was in Israel. The view in Israel, and I have a lot of friends there and talk to them, the view in Israel was, yeah, we had an intelligence failure, but we'll deal with that later, right? We'll deal with that after the combat's over, right? And we, nothing like a failure for the media in the United States, right? So that was another thought. And my most important thought was, as I was reading all of the pieces that were being written by a lot of different people on Israel's intelligence failure, laying out all sorts of different reasons why, I was like, whoa, hold on a second. Hold on a second, right? We have no idea why the failure occurred. And all you people who are out there writing that why, suggesting reasons why, you really don't know. You're guessing. And we're not going to know until, the war is over and Israel, probably has some sort of commission that looks at the intelligence failure and the military operational failure and comes to some conclusions. And I remind people that, between us knowing that Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction, when we came to that conclusion on the ground after the war, between that moment when we knew we were wrong and the moment when we had some degree of confidence in understanding why we were wrong was a pretty long period of time. It's probably at least a year of work, of study, of task forces, really digging into, why did we make this mistake? And so if you list all the reasons why we were wrong, I'm not sure you would have guessed them on day one of knowing you were wrong, right? So a lot of people, suggesting making this suggestion or that suggestion about what happened. I'm going to say take a breath, take a pause. We'll figure it out, and it's going to be more complicated than you think.
Yeah, and I think the key is being sure that you're learning from your mistakes and figuring out why it happened so you can try to stop it happening again, which, we've had our intelligence failures and we've done that in the past. So, and like you said, I think, it was an intel failure, a military response failure, but at the end of the day, intel, it is a hard business. And, it's the whole, the old saying that, the successes never get seen or known about. It's only the failures. And, they become glaringly obvious to everyone. But I think, the fact that, this business is hard and sometimes you miss things and you don't have the intel. I think we saw that here.
I do think the context, right? I do think the context, right? As an analyst, context is everything, right? So I do think the context here is interesting, which is number one, Israel is arguably, has the best intelligence capabilities on the planet, right? I said this the other day in front of a former senior U.S. intelligence official. He corrected me and said, "No, we do." And I sat there thinking to myself, "No, no, 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 we don't. They do." So that's one piece of context. The other piece of context, it's really hard to overstate the intelligence blanket that Israel had laid over Gaza, right? So one of my thoughts was, given that context, was, you know, there's intelligence failures and there's counterintelligence successes. So how much of this was Hamas's success? And how much of it was Israel's failure? Now, they're two sides of the same coin, but I bet you we're going to find out. And here now I'm speculating, right? Here I'm speculating. And then we're going to find out that Hamas did some pretty interesting things to stay under the radar.
Yeah, Hamas exists in this world of making the Israelis have an intelligence failure. So, and on that point, though, moving forward a little bit, as you said, we need to take a breath, and they are focused on the response right now. But Intel is also going to play a major role in their response, especially in a place like Gaza when you're trying to go in and sort of hunt down these groups of Hamas terrorists and fighters and try to find them with these tunneling systems and all the things they have in place there. So while we need to sort of put the Intel thing on the back burner to think about it, they also need it right now a lot. So what role do you think that's going to play in the coming weeks as they are prepping to invade and as they get on the ground?
Yeah. So first of all, I agree with you. Obviously, absolutely critical. I think part of it is I'm sure the Israeli military, the IDF, had on its shelf a war plan for going into Gaza, right? That's what militaries do. They plan for war, right? I'm sure there was a Gaza invasion war plan, right, that they took off the shelf. But I'm also sure that given how Hamas was able to surprise Israel, that they really need to dust off that plan and rethink it because that plan assumes a certain level of Hamas capabilities, both from an intelligence and counterintelligence perspective, but also from a military operational perspective. And I'm sure they had to relook at the military plan in light of Hamas's demonstrated capabilities. So that's one, right? And then I think the other is obviously intelligence on where the hostages are. It's finding the location of Hamas leaders so you can kill them or capture them. So I think, that's kind of the role for Gaza. And then there's a much bigger, right? There's this great fear, which I share, of the broadening of this war, right? The broadening of the war to Hezbollah in Lebanon, the broadening of the war to Shia militant attacks on U.S. facilities in Iraq and Syria, the broadening of the war to the West Bank, right? There's all this concern about broadening. And so Israeli intelligence can't be over-focused on Gaza. They have other things they have to focus on. And everybody's got to keep an eye on Iran here, right? I don't think Iran's interested in fighting a war with Israel, but it doesn't mean you can't stay intensely focused on it given the potential risks.
Yeah. And I'm sure this is where The U.S.-Israeli intelligence partnership is playing a major role as well, of sharing of intel and us sort of doing some of that work with them and for them at the same time.
And people should know, right? People should know, and this is not a secret. People should know that the relationship between U.S. intelligence community and the Israeli intelligence community is really as close as it could possibly be.
Yes, exactly. One, I guess, last question to kind of get you out of here on this, and it's again tied to Hamas Israel and sort of speaks to what we've talked about on a lot of this releasing of intelligence and that kind of stuff. But there's obviously been a lot of that around the explosion at the hospital and, analysis of open source intel of stuff that was classified. And you talked about like the comms that we probably got that was sort of unclassified comms that were catching of soldiers in Russia and stuff. Same thing in Hamas. They caught those two Hamas guys that were talking about the rocket and stuff like that. So what were your thoughts on that? How that all played out from an intel perspective?
Yeah, my thought when I saw the first news report that the Israelis had struck a hospital was, whoa, hang on a second, right? And I think CNN even went with it, right? You got to be so careful, right, in these situations. Disinformation, misinformation is not new, but boy, it's become another domain of war, I think. Given that your first reaction to any new information should be skeptical, right? Be skeptical. Let more facts come out before you come to a judgment. That's the first thing I thought of, and I think that's the lesson from this.
Yeah. And especially when it's something to that magnitude, I think is even more important. But all right, Michael Morell, I'd also like to let our listeners know that your podcast, Intelligence Matters, is back, and they should all go and listen to that, as I will be doing as well.
We're happy to be back. To find it, you need to search Intelligence Matters, the relaunch, wherever you get your podcasts.
All right, sounds great. And thanks again for joining us. And yeah, this has been interesting. Thanks.
Thanks, Kelly. Good to be with you.
Thank you again to Michael Morell for his time and thoughts. And a reminder that we'll put a link to his show, Intelligence Matters, in our show notes for this episode. Tune in next Thursday for our second episode of Headlines in History, where we'll deep dive into the impact of the Biden administration's new AI policy with Andrew Imbrie. This episode was produced by Jarrett Dang and Freddie Mallinson. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GUDiplomacy, and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.